Hey guys, I'm Mei. I'm one of the Whole Family student guides, and today I put together a little solo student guide chat for us all that was inspired by an English class I took this past semester called Modern Women Writers, and that I also hope will be relevant to us all spending a lot of time at home these days. So I've called it The Hidden Art of Homemaking, and we'll start by talking a little bit about Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. And then from there, we'll switch gears and get into the Harvard Art Museums and look at three works that I think really bring to life and develop some of Woolf's ideas from A Room of One's Own. All right, so to start with, let's talk a little bit about A Room of One's Own. A Room of One's Own is an extended essay by Virginia Woolf, who we see here, that was first published in 1929, and this is a picture of the original cover. It's based on two lectures Woolf gave the year before at a women's college at the University of Cambridge. And in the essay, Woolf primarily addresses the status of women and women artists and is exploring the obstacles that Woolf believes have really inhibited women's creativity at the time. She asserts that one, a woman must have money in a room of her own, hence the title, if she is to write. But also, besides not having space or enough money to pursue creative endeavors, Woolf argues that women writers have also been held back because there's a lack of any ongoing tradition for women's writing. And because of that, in the literature at the time, so much of women's experiences were underrepresented or never shown at all. And Woolf investigates why. She comes to the conclusion that maybe using the language of the time that was predominantly shaped by men and tied to male values, the authentic woman's experience was unrepresentable. And so Woolf asks female writers to break free of this and to establish their own style, or female lyric, as she calls it. And in this female lyric, to remake forms of words that can better represent women's authentic experiences and speak with a unique woman's voice. She wants female writers to make the private lives of women dignified as valid subject matter, which hadn't been done before, and to find a kind of literary home within these domestic domains. And within these domestic domains, to focus and bring out the moments of incandescence and beauty in everyday life. So, with that background in mind, I want to next turn to three artworks in the museum that we see here that I think work with subject matter, techniques, or materials that have typically been dismissed by the art world as mundane and dignify their domestic worlds, as Woolf was calling for, as valid content for art. So we'll see how these three artists have, in a way, developed a female lyric, like the one Woolf is calling for in A Room of One's Own, to break into their respective male-dominated art movements. And to start with, we'll go to this first painting here. But to begin, I first want to share a bit about Mei Cassatt, who is the painter herself. So here we see a portrait of Mei Cassatt. She was from Philadelphia, and she convinced her father in 1866 to let her study art in Europe. And this was very unheard of for females in her day. And after studying art in Europe, she settled permanently in Paris and really dedicated her life to her artistic profession. She never ended up getting married or having children. And she was A big part of the Impressionist group, which you might be familiar with, they focused on depicting everyday modern life in new, fresh ways, and served as a big departure from the outdated academic art modes that dominated at the time. But even within this movement, within the context of Impressionism, Mary Cassatt's imagery was really unique because it refused to conform to standard male images of women. At the time Cassatt was creating, upper class bourgeois women could either stay home, or if they ventured out, they had to do so with a proper chaperone. And so female artists like Cassatt naturally had fewer experiences to draw on, unfortunately, than their male colleagues. But she kind of used this to her advantage, as we'll see, I think, and was still able to capture the beauty and power within those lived experiences of women more at home at the time. So with all that said, let's take a closer look at this painting in the Harvard Art Museums by Cassatt. It's titled Woman on a Striped Sofa with Dog, quite literally, and was created in 1876. And I really love it. It's really charming to me. And we can see upon first glance, the subject is really the vibrant energy of this young woman. Her figure dominates the canvas, and we see her in just an everyday moment that might go unnoticed otherwise. And she's playing with her dog. The dog, now that I take a closer look, looks kind of uncomfortable and stiff, which is funny. I hope the dog's okay. But anyways, this subject here, this young woman, is not looking at us, not looking at the viewers. She's really immersed in her own enjoyment of her dog and this everyday moment. She's not here for the enjoyment of others or the enjoyment of us. And her pose is also very self-contained and kind of self-assured. And I find it interesting that the focus here is not her physique or body, but really the activity she's engaged in. And we get a clear sense of her personality. She seems playful, carefree. She has a real concrete presence in this painting. And I think we can better appreciate the power of this painting by Cassatt by looking at some other images from the Impressionist art movement at the time that depicted women. So we see here Monet's Woman in the Garden from 1866 and Bazille's The Artist's Studio from 1870. And most depictions of women in Impressionist art were like these, with very conservative stock images of women. Here in Monet's painting, the women are really decoratively grouped, and little focus is given to them, if at all, as individuals. They're represented more as other flowers in the garden. And here in Bazille's painting, these women that are only featured in these nude paintings are mere witnesses at the scene we're looking at. Their images are presiding over the activities of men only. One's playing a piano, we see two are talking about this painting, and two more in conversation here. So if we look back to Cassatt's painting, we can see how she's really challenging these inauthentic or stereotypic images of women. She's making women the subject and not the object of her work. They're not here for the enjoyment of us. This woman here is given a real concrete presence and vibrant energy. So she turned to these experiences of women's inner lives, and instead of trivializing them, she gave them a new unconsidered power, I think. She says so herself in her own words, that she believed women should be someone and not something. And I think this is very evocative of that. All right, so next we'll hop to our second piece in this chat, which is by Annie Albers, and it's made in 1948. And before we go to that piece, like we did before, we'll just get a handle on Albers herself, who has a really fascinating background. So Albers, who we see here, was a poster woman for the Bauhaus School. And the Bauhaus School is fascinating. Yeah, I find it endlessly interesting. It's a very radical art and design school. And it was founded in Weimar in 1919 by someone named Walter Gropius. And at the heart, it functioned like a lab for industrial innovations and was very forward looking. Artists there created new designs for mass production that used modern materials but really good, sophisticated modern design. And Albers was a student there, and she finished the foundations coursework that was required for all students. And she says she originally wanted to study drawing and painting afterwards, but she was pushed to join the weaving workshop, which was often referred to as well as the women's workshop. So she talks about entering this workshop initially with little enthusiasm, but took it up anyways and quickly discovered how expressive textiles could actually be and use them to apply all that she learned before at the Bauhaus School, using the shuttle and loom. And so she fundamentally transformed the ancient craft of weaving within the school into a real modernist art form. And it's interesting, I'll quote here from her reasons about the power of weaving. She sees it like this: painting is applied onto something, Albers says. Sculpture uses a given material. Weaving is closest to architecture because it is a building up out of a single element, building a whole out of single elements. So she's discovering this power of this kind of dismissed, overlooked craft. And let's look at a textile of hers. So here, oops, sorry about that. We're looking at Annie Albers's wall hanging textile, which was made in 1948, as I mentioned earlier. And it's mainly neutral colors. Her palette here is all neutral threads primarily. It had a real focus on modern geometric design that we can see. And this design and pattern is largely based on just repeating interlocking forms of stripes and blocks, as we can see. And it was created with what was called the triple weaving technique. So its clean, sharp lines and geometric pattern really evoked the utilitarian spirit that the Bauhaus was known for. And Albers, with her textiles, intended to create designs that could eventually become models for industrial production, so in line with the Bauhaus School's fundamental mission. And in doing so with her textiles, as I mentioned a bit before, she really fused this ancient craft of weaving with the language of modern art and elevated it to new heights. And this is important, just some context about weaving itself. So weaving was primarily thought of as domestic women's crafts. Weaving was traditionally dismissed as inferior to pursuits like painting and sculpture. So originally Albers didn't really want to go into weaving any much herself. And women for centuries in Western culture would just take up the craft at home or in factories to earn pocket money. It was a real practical task and not considered an artistic pursuit. But this hierarchy of fine art and crafts really marginalized women who made up most of the weavers. And I think we can look at the power of this as Albers reclaiming the stitch in a way, reclaiming the stitch away from these associations with household woman's work and as a lowly craft. And she's using it to weave brilliant modern designs. Now we'll go to our third piece on the tour, which is by Joan Snyder. Here we see Joan Snyder in her studio. Snyder is an American painter who's still alive, the only one of the three, and she's interested in personal experiences and the ritualistic process of painting. She says Snyder talks about wanting to show the true anatomy of a painting, the different layers as it was being made, and focusing on the process and making the process clear to viewers. And the painting we'll look at by Joan Snyder is called Summer Orange. Unfortunately, there aren't too many great images of summer orange online, but I think this one does the job. We just miss out on the true vibrancy of the colors. So I encourage you all, when we can get back on campus and into the museums, to come take a look at this in person for yourself. But this is one of her stroke paintings, and we see initially it's basically a lot of marks, drips, and brushstrokes arranged on this subtle grid across the canvas, which might be easy to miss at first glance. This grid is just lightly penciled behind these marks, and the grid seems to organize these marks, but actually the patches don't fall within the grid at all. They go way far out of the lines, and these areas of paint seem to have been just sprayed and smeared on really haphazardly. And there's so many different materials Snyder is using here to create. She stains the canvas in parts we can see, and then she also applies pigment in other parts with spray paint and glitter. So really non-traditional kind of household everyday materials. And I think the tension of this riot of color and these strokes bursting out of the grid and this grid behind it that seemingly is there to lend the painting structure builds this tension between order and disorder. And the colors are so bright and full of force, dripping in places, and in person you can tell a bit more clearly. You can see the texture. A lot of them have been very thickly applied, so there's this tension between pattern and chaos and control and spontaneity. And Snyder talks about these stroke paintings and says they were about, quoting here, order and then letting go, speaking, creating a language or a structure to speak. She talks about these stroke paintings and says the strokes are about the paint itself, paint moving across the canvas, paint as a medium for feelings, sensations, or sounds, paint suggesting a real storyline. So I think I see that a lot here, and maybe you guys do too, that each very lush, almost ribbon-like stroke of paint has so much energy and force that it's kind of like a character in a story. It's pulsing with this emotion and vitality. And to contextualize this piece so we can better appreciate its power, I think it's helpful to look at a piece that is more typical of art at the time and was created in a minimalist style. So at the time Snyder made Summer Orange, the art world was really dominated by pieces like this. This would have made up the more cool, hard-edged minimalism movement, and minimalist artists like we'll hear Frank Stella's Hyena Stomp removed any trace of emotion or personal expression. They created works that were as impersonal and neutral as possible. Here it's a very rigid grid, and everything is clean and crisp and really stands out compared to Snyder's Summer Orange. And so it's also important to consider, though, the broader impact of this movement's ideology, because minimalists wanted to strip any biography from their art. They ended up silencing a lot of identity-based political movements of the 60s and 70s, like feminism. And as a result, mainstream minimalism was most dominated by men. And Snyder's work, we'll go back to it here, really flew in the face of minimalist conventions. And Snyder shared in interviews that she grew up with minimalism and wanted and needed more than that in her work. And we can see she went complete the opposite way from minimalism. Instead of adopting these minimalist techniques, she went almost maximalist. And she challenged the definitions of high art that were dominated by this minimalism movement with its less is more philosophy. And we talked about the tension this piece has before. Instead of, as we saw in the Frank Stella painting before, denying conflict, here Snyder is embracing conflict and tension and forging beauty out of this conflict. And she ended up creating so many new opportunities for narrative within abstraction. If you're interested, her later works get even more maximalist and cool. So I encourage you to give her a quick Google afterwards. And the power of her art is really tremendous to her personally, and I think to us now. Snyder said painting with her maximalist style that we can see her finding here felt like speaking for the first time. And to tie it back to Woolf, we can look at that then. She's developing her own female lyric to speak visually within this male-dominated art world. And about the idea of homemaking too, I think her own female lyric did link homemaking and the idea of decoration with creative expression. Her work kind of has a sense of humor and is playful with glitter and spray paint even. But Snyder says so herself. She says it's intentionally playful, but just because it has glitter in it doesn't mean it's not dead serious too. And I really like that comment by Snyder. And so thinking about the three artists we've looked at, Cassatt, Albers, and now Snyder, Snyder is exploring new ways to create within male-dominated art worlds by finding and defining for herself unique female sensibilities or lyrics. And Snyder was very intentional about this. We can see here notebook entry Snyder wrote defining her own female sensibility as layers, words, membranes, cotton, cloth, rope, repetition of bodies, wet, opening, closing, repetition, lists, life stories. So there's just so much energy. She couldn't just create using the language of the time that was mostly shaped by minimalism. She invented her own lyric and sensibility through which to create and create really beautiful, powerful pieces of art. Now we'll just sum up what we chatted about together. So here again is Cassatt's piece, then Albers' textile, and lastly, we talked about Snyder's stroke painting, Summer Orange. And thinking back to A Room of One's Own, that which we talked about at the very beginning. Um, to me, each of these inspiring artists add to this creation of a female tradition or feminine lyric that Woolf said was lacking at the time she wrote A Room of One's Own. Woolf writes in A Room of One's Own, and I'll quote here because Woolf says it so beautifully. Woolf writes that she wanted women artists to record unknown or unrecorded things, to shine light on small things and show perhaps they are not small after all, to bring buried things to light and make one wonder what need there had been to bury them. And thinking about this quote and what Woolf was asking women artists to do and what they needed to do, I think these three artists all do that and carry that out. They are finding beauty and power in everyday moments like we see here, or in domestic crafts like weaving, and or in playful materials like glitter and bursts of spray paint. So if you're still watching, thank you so much for tuning in to this guide chat. These works really inspire me to find the beauty and magic in our more simple lives at home now, and to cherish the moments I'd otherwise miss or ignore. And I hope these three pieces, this three artists' story, and some of Virginia Woolf's words have inspired you to stay safe and healthy, and keep checking back on Harvard Art Happens for more guide chats and cool other things to do to keep us engaged in the museum and art while we're home. Thanks, guys.